Levon Helm, the name itself feels like American music. He was more than the legendary drummer and singer for the band. He was its heartbeat, the very soul of a sound that seemed to rise right out of the soil. His drumming wasn't about keeping time, it was about telling a story. It was swampy, greasy, and deeply human. It was the sound of a good harvest and a long drought, a Saturday night barn dance and a Sunday morning hymn, all rolled into one. He famously said his job was to sing the tonic, the center of the harmony, which is exactly what he did on the drums. He was the anchor, the foundation everything else was built on. But here's the thing that gets lost in the legend. The man who played with so much soul had an incredibly specific, passionate, and unshakable belief about what music should be. He had a philosophy, a creed, forged in the juke joints and on the radio waves of the Arkansas Delta, and that creed created a stark dividing line between his world and the world of many, many other drummers. This has led to whispers and rumors. Over the years, a kind of rock and roll folklore that paints Levon as a guy who had quiet contempt for a certain kind of musician. A man who, behind that warm, grandfatherly smile, kept a list of drummers he just couldn't stand. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on those rumored rivalries. We're going to explore the 6 archetypes of drummers that stood in the most dramatic opposition to everything Levon Helm believed in. These are, by reputation, the drummers Levon Helm hated the most. But the truth we uncovered is not what you expect, and it reveals everything about his revolutionary and deeply traditional approach to music. Before we get to the list, you have to understand the man at its center. This isn't just about music, it's about a cultural war. A war between what Levon saw as authentic, heartfelt American music and the forces he felt were trying to kill it. To get Levon Helm, you have to go back to Turkey Scratch, Arkansas. In the 1940s and 50s, you have to picture a young boy tuning a radio, pulling ghosts out of the air. On one station, you had the Grand Ole Opry. On another, the raw electric blues of WLAC in Nashville. And most importantly, you had the King Biscuit Time radio show, broadcast from right there in Helena, Arkansas. This was Levon's school, his church. In his autobiography, This Wheel's on Fire, he talks about it with an almost holy reverence. The sound of the blues, rhythm and blues, country music, is what we lived for, black and white alike. He wrote, it gave you strength to sit on one of those throbbing Alstomers tractors all day. This wasn't background noise, it was fuel for a hard life. And at the heart of that sound, for Levon, was a drummer named James Peck Curtis, who played with the blues harmonica legend Sonny Boy Williamson. Levon would sneak into the radio station to watch, his eyes glued to Peck Curtis. He wasn't watching a technician, he was watching a man have the most fun in the room. Curtis didn't just play the beat, he danced around it. His style was loose, intuitive, and all about the story of the song. That was the lightning bolt moment. That was the core of the philosophy Levon Helm would carry for the rest of his life. And that philosophy is simple, but profound. You play for the song, you serve the song, you don't stand on top of it, you don't show off, and you don't draw attention to yourself. Your job as the drummer is to make everyone else sound better. It's to create a feeling, a pocket so deep and comfortable that the singer can relax, the guitarist can weave their magic, and the story can just unfold. As he once said, if you give it good concentration, good energy, good heart, and good performance, the song will play you. This belief was so ingrained in him that he saw drumming and singing as two sides of the same coin. He sang the tonic, the root of the chord, the center. He played the beat, the root of the rhythm, the center. Anything that pulled away from that center, that screamed look at me, was a betrayal. If it doesn't come from your heart, he believed, music just doesn't work. So, as rock and roll exploded and evolved, Levon Helm stood like a guardian of this older tradition. He watched as drumming got faster, louder, and way more complex. He saw drummers become stars in their own right, with massive kits and 10-minute solos. And you can just imagine him shaking his head, not in anger, but in a kind of sorrowful confusion. This wasn't personal hatred, it was a philosophical one. It was the quiet, firm conviction of a master craftsman watching the world fall in love with mass-produced furniture. This is the lens for our list. This isn't about backstage fights, it's about a clash of ideologies. Each drummer on this list represents, in their own unique way, a total rejection of the Peck Curtis school of thought. They are the antithesis of playing for the song. And for a man like Levon Helm, their approach would have felt like a foreign language, a beautiful, intricate, and popular language that he just had no desire to learn. Let's get into it. First up is a man revered by millions as a drum god, a figure whose technical precision and intellectual approach are the stuff of legend, Neil Peart of Rush. They called him the Professor, and it fits. If Levon Helm was the soulful farmer tilling the soil of the song, Neil Peart was the brilliant architect, building dizzying, rhythmic skyscrapers that touched the heavens of musical complexity. To get why their worlds were so opposed, you have to understand Rush. They were a three-piece band that sounded like an orchestra. That wasn't an accident. The space that a rhythm guitarist would normally fill was, in Rush, filled by Neil Peart's drums. He didn't just keep the beat. He was a lead instrument, a one-man percussion symphony. His massive, wraparound drum kit wasn't for show. Every single piece, the concert toms, the wood blocks, the chimes, was a different color in his sonic paintbox, and he used them all. Peart's style was meticulous, composed, and breathtakingly complex. He built his parts like a mathematician, solving an equation. His fills were cascading avalanches of perfectly executed notes. His use of odd time signatures and shifting meters was groundbreaking. Drum parts on songs like Tom Sawyer or 2112 aren't just rhythms, they're compositions in themselves, narrative arcs that mirror the band's epic lyrical themes. He was a self-admitted perfectionist, once completely reinventing his playing by taking lessons from jazz guru Freddie Gruber just to rebuild his technique from scratch. Now, hold that image in your mind. The intellectual, precise, compositional architect, and contrast it with Levon Helm. Levon's drums were tuned low and muffled, with a warm, organic thud. Peart's were tuned for crystal clarity and precision. Levon's whole creed was to find the pocket and stay there, to make the beat feel good. Peart's mission was to explore the outer limits of what was rhythmically possible. Levon once said, "Drums usually seem to tune themselves. It's almost impossible to imagine Neil Peart, a man who thought through every single stroke, ever leaving something so important to chance." For Levon, the shuffle was the key to rock and roll, that loose, human, behind-the-beat feel that makes you want to dance. Peart's playing, for all its genius, was often on top of the beat, driving and precise. It made you want to listen, to analyze, to marvel at its complexity, but it rarely made you want to dance in that same greasy, juke joint way. The very idea of a long, composed drum solo, a staple of a Rush show, was poison to Levon's philosophy. For Helm, a solo was a brief, joyful shout, not a dissertation. There's no record of Levon ever badmouthing Neil Peart. That wasn't his style. But we can see the deep philosophical canyon between them. To Levon, music was about emotion, heart, and connecting to something ancient in the American soul. A song was a story about people, places, and feelings. For Peart, a song was often an idea, a concept, a complex piece of architecture. You can imagine Levon hearing the staggering technicality of a song like YYZ, and while maybe respecting the skill, quietly thinking to himself, but where's the dirt, where's the soul, where's the song? It's a fundamental disagreement. On the purpose of a drummer, are you the foundation, or the lead voice, the heartbeat, or the brain? For Levon, the answer was never in doubt. If Neil Peart was Levon's opposite in terms of intellectual complexity, our next drummer was his polar opposite in pure, untamed chaos. Keith Moon of The Who. Moon the Loon. He didn't just play the drums. He attacked them. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of flailing arms and explosive energy that felt like it could send the whole band flying off the stage. Keith Moon's style was basically one continuous, unbridled drum fill. He famously ditched the hi-hat, not to keep a steady rhythm, but to free up his limbs for more cymbal crashing, tom-rolling anarchy. Where most drummers were the anchor, Moon was another lead instrument. You could argue that The Who had 4 lead instruments: Roger Daltrey's voice, Pete Townshend's guitar, John Entwistle's bass, and Keith Moon's drums. He rarely played a standard rock beat for more than a couple of bars, instead offering a running commentary, accenting vocals and guitar riffs with unpredictable explosions. His approach was all instinct, not technique. It was raw power and a celebration of freedom. He played with a ferocity that was thrilling, and at times, felt like it was on the verge of total collapse. He was famous for his double bass drums and a massive wall of toms, which he treated less like an instrument, and more like a set of things to be hit, and hit hard. His fills weren't the polished runs of Neil Peart. They were tribal, primitive, and impulsive. And just a musician. He was a performer, a technician, and an athlete, surrounded by a colossal fortress of drums, gongs, and percussion. Carl Palmer's style was a masterclass in speed, power, and precision. He had a background in serious percussion study, even taking lessons at the Royal Academy. This formal training was obvious in everything he played. His solos weren't just about endurance. They were structured, thematic compositions, often using tuned percussion like marimba. His work with ELP was the definition of extra. The music was complex, ornate, and often based on classical pieces, requiring a drummer who could navigate intricate arrangements in lightning-fast unison lines with the other 2 virtuosos in the band. The visual element was a huge part of the deal. Palmer was famous for playing shirtless or striking the massive gongs that flanked his kit. The drum set itself was an outrageous spectacle, a gleaming chrome and brass monument to drumming excess. This was drumming as a theatrical event, designed to dazzle and overwhelm. Now, contrast this with the earthy, understated world of Levon Helm. If Carl Palmer was the flamboyant Olympic athlete, Levon was the seasoned farmer with an unshakable, natural strength. Levon's kit was simple. His movements were economical. Palmer's was a gargantuan playground. Levon's philosophy was to disappear into the song, to become part of its fabric. Palmer's role was to stand out, to be a co-star, to match the pyrotechnics of his bandmates with his own percussive fireworks. The very idea of a percussion concerto, which Palmer worked on, is a concept so far from Levon Helm's musical universe it's almost funny. Levon found his art in the tiny nuances of a simple backbeat, in the way a slight hesitation or push could change a song's entire feel. He once said, "If you give it good concentration, good energy, good heart, and good performance, the song will play you." That implies a surrender to the music, a letting go. Carl Palmer's style, in contrast, was about conquering the music. It was about mastering its technical challenges and executing its hardest parts with flawless precision. There's no malice in this comparison. Both are valid artistic approaches that gave us incredible music, but they represent two warring schools of thought. One sees drumming as a craft in service of the whole. The other sees it as a high art, a display of virtuosity on par with any lead instrument. For Levon, who came from a tradition where the song was king and the musicians were its loyal subjects, the prog rock royalty of a band like Elp would have seemed like a different species entirely. He would have heard the dizzying speed and complexity, and, while respecting the skill, probably would have felt it was all sound and fury, signifying nothing without that deep, simple, human groove at its core. Our final entry might seem like an odd one. Phil Collins, while he had prog rock roots with Genesis, his biggest mark on the drumming world, and the one that puts him on this list, came from his revolutionary work as a pop producer and solo artist in the 80s. He didn't just play the drums, he fundamentally changed how they were recorded, creating a sound that would define a decade and stand as a monument to everything. Levon Helm was not. Phil Collins's genius is his incredible versatility. He could handle the complex time signatures of early Genesis, but he was also a master of the simple, melodic groove, thanks to his love of Motown. But his most famous contribution is, without a doubt, the gated reverb drum sound, which exploded onto the scene with his 1981 solo hit, "In the Air Tonight." This sound, found almost by accident in the studio, was massive, dramatic, and unmistakably artificial. It was created by heavily compressing the room's ambient sound and then cutting it off sharply with a noise gate. The result was a thunderous, explosive whoosh that had immense power but no natural decay. It was the ultimate studio creation. Combined with his use of drum machines and electronic pads, Collins became the architect of a new kind of rhythm. Clean, polished, powerful, and perfect for the pop charts. His drum parts were often crafted as much by the producer and the technology as by the drummer. This is the ultimate philosophical clash with Levon Helm. Levon's entire sound was about being natural. It was about the sound of wood and skin in a room. It was about the imperfections, the slightly behind the beat feel, the warm, organic decay of a note. His drumming was the enemy of the click track. It was human. The Phil Collins sound of the 80s was about using technology to achieve a kind of superhuman perfection. It was tight, precise, and perfectly slotted into a slick, polished production. Levon once said, "Drums just always sounded like the most fun part of that good music for me." His approach was all feel. The gated reverb sound and the rise of drum machines took the fun, organic part of drumming and replaced it with calculated, produced perfection. For Levon, the sound came from the player's hands and heart. For 80s Collins, the sound often came from the mixing board. Just imagine Levon Helm in a studio in 1985. The producer asks him to play to a drum machine. He's told that his natural breathing groove needs to be Qantas locked perfectly to a grid. He's told the warm, woody sound of his Ludwig kit will be replaced by a massive, artificial, gated explosion. It's just unimaginable. It goes against every fiber of his musical being. If it doesn't come from your heart, music just doesn't work, he insisted. The highly processed drum sounds of the 80s, pioneered by Collins, would have sounded to Levon like they came from a machine, not a human heart. It was a sound that was wildly popular and influential. But it was the sound of a world where authenticity, as Levon understood it, had been sacrificed at the altar of production. So, after this journey through a gallery of drumming giants, we have to ask the question we started with: did Levon Helm truly hate Neil Peart, Keith Moon, John Bonham, Ginger Baker, Carl Palmer, and Phil Collins? The answer, based on all the credible evidence we have, is a clear and resounding no. There is no record, not in his interviews, not in his candid autobiography, not from his closest friends and collaborators of Levon Helm, ever expressing personal hatred or even strong artistic criticism towards any of these specific drummers by name. The very idea of a hate list is a fabrication, a piece of rock and roll mythology. The real feuds in Levon's life were deeply personal and painful, centered on brotherhood, credit, and money. Most famously, his long and bitter dispute with Robbie Robertson. Those were battles over legacy and livelihood, not over drumming styles. Why did we walk you through this list? Because the provocative clickbait idea of a hate list is a doorway. It's a hook that lets us get at a much deeper, more important truth. The hatred was never personal. It was philosophical. Levon Helm wasn't at war with these men. He was at war with an idea. He was in a lifelong battle to defend a particular kind of musical authenticity. Each of these 6 drummers represents an archetype of what he stood against. The intellectual complexity that overshadowed the song. The chaotic showmanship that valued spectacle over substance. The thunderous bombast that made the drummer the star, not the servant. The combative virtuosity that prized conflict over cohesion. The athletic technicality that celebrated precision over feel. And the processed production that replaced human touch with studio perfection. For Levon, these weren't just matters of taste, they were matters of principle. He came from a world where music was a fundamental part of life, a force that could get you through a long day of hard labor. It was functional, it was communal, it had a purpose beyond being impressive. If you pour some music on whatever's wrong, it'll sure help out, he said. For him, the kind of music that helps, the kind that heals, needed to be honest. It needed to have dirt on its boots. It needed to feel like it was made by human hands, for human hearts. What we've really been exploring isn't a list of enemies, but a series of signposts that help define the borders of Levon Helm's musical homeland. By understanding what he wasn't, we can see so much more clearly what he was. He was the keeper of an older flame. In an age of accelerating virtuosity and technology, he was a powerful reminder that the most profound musical statements are often the simplest, that the deepest groove isn't the most complex one, and that the most important job of any musician is to listen, connect, and serve the song. The truth isn't that Levon Helm was a man full of hate. The truth is, he was a man full of a powerful, unwavering love for a certain kind of music. A love so strong, it didn't leave much room for anything else. In the end, the story of the drummers Levon Helm hated isn't a story about hate at all. It's a story about devotion. It's a testament to a man who knew exactly who he was, where he came from, and what he believed in, and never once wavered. He was born in the Arkansas Delta, and in a way, his drumming never left. It was always rooted in the earth, in the blues, in the simple, powerful truths of American music. He watched rock and roll evolve from a folk art into a global industry. He saw it move from the dance hall to the stadium, from the front porch to the high-tech studio, and through it all, he held his ground. He didn't chase trends. He didn't update his style. He just kept playing with the same honesty, soul, and deep, infectious groove he learned from watching men like Peck Curtis all those years ago. The legacies of the drummers we've talked about are secure. They are giants who inspired millions and pushed the instrument in incredible ways. But Levon Helm's legacy is something